All right. So, um, I was out last week, didn't get to do a top 10, but I'm sure I'm back to piss all y'all off now. I've got Ohio State number one. I don't know why the AP continues to have Georgia over Ohio State. And look, like, I think Georgia would maybe be a slight favorite over Ohio State on a neutral field right now? Yes. But it's got to be when you're doing rankings, resume plus kind of that power ranking thing. And Ohio State hasn't really had the knucklehead game that Georgia had against Kent State, that Georgia had against Missouri. So I don't get that. I think today was dominant. Obviously, even in ugly, they looked ugly for a while. They won 54-10 or whatever. Georgia number two. I think that for all of those issues of the ugly games, if it's with these elite teams, it's like when they have to turn it on, they do turn it on. A lot of teams week in and week out, you see they're playing as hard as they can, maybe above their heads a little bit. And these elite teams, you give them a month to prepare, and they're just going to be they're just going to turn it on. So I got Georgia number two. I've got Tennessee number three. Basically a bye week this week, 65-21, I think, against UT Martin, the team from Tennessee that wears Auburn's uniform. The thing is, Josh, a lot of people are saying Alabama's a fraud, Alabama's trash, but they have Tennessee in the top three. I've had Tennessee number 4 for a month now. So I was on that bandwagon early, and I'll continue to take credit for it. But if Tennessee is your number 3 team in the country and they beat Alabama at home, so Alabama had to travel to Neyland Stadium. They committed 17 turnovers or 17 penalties, missed a game-winning field goal at the end of the game to lose that game to Tennessee, then Alabama's got to be right there. Alabama would be probably a 6-7 point favorite over Tennessee on a neutral field. Michigan number 4. This is more because right now I think Alabama's better than Michigan. I got them number 5. I think Alabama's better than Michigan, but I do want to reward Michigan for beating the crap out of Penn State, who is not an elite team, but I think is a good team. And I think Michigan deserves that credit because Alabama doesn't have that kind of win on their resume, and they could have done it tonight, but they messed around, stepped on their what's for basically the entire second half. Bryce Young looked really bad for a lot of this game. I know he does the run around wizard thing and he has some big plays and big moments, but they have no offensive identity. I feel like Alabama could score 75 or 17 against the same team in consecutive weeks. It's really weird, but they did have a dominant defensive performance. I've got Clemson at number 6. Everybody's going to keep Clemson up because they beat number 14 Syracuse. Syracuse has less talent on their team than Vanderbilt in terms of rankings and such. And DJU couldn't get it done today. If it was solely up to him, they would have lost that game. I don't think Clemson's great. I think they're the benefit of a weak schedule. They've got some issues defensively too. This is where it gets really tough for me. I've got Oklahoma State at number 7. I think Texas is a very good football team who also is a very flawed football team. And Oklahoma State hung in there and came back and won that game, I still think Oklahoma State has some defensive issues, but they did hold that Texas team to, I think, 3 points in the second half, and that 3 points came on a short field. Oregon, number 8, I don't think they're a great team. I think that these next 3 show kind of what we talk about when we say the playoffs shouldn't be expanded. I've got Oregon number 8, and I don't think they're anywhere close to the top 5. Like, I think Alabama would beat Oregon bad, and they're not even in my top 4 right now. That's why we're harping on this so much. One, it's really hard to do a top 10, especially with some of the parity we have down the line this year. And 2, the fact that we're having to put these teams in the top 10 just proves how absurd a 12-team college football playoff is. I've got Kansas State number 9. This is the team that maybe everybody would kind of raise an eyebrow at because they had that bad loss to a G5 team. But Kansas State has handled their business otherwise this year. and offensively has actually looked pretty good. So I'm going to reward them for that. And Wake Forest at number 10. While I don't think Clemson is great, I think that overtime loss to Clemson is their only loss. 3 top 10 teams lost today. I know there's going to be this pull to put USC back in the top 10 because they have one loss. They were only dropped to like 12th. I wouldn't do it. They should have lost a couple of games already this year. They haven't looked great offensively this year. I don't have USC in my top 10. I've got Wake at number 10. Really good offense, not great defense, but everybody's flawed down there at this point. Josh, give me yours.
Yeah, so my top 10, it's interesting. The top of it is pretty easy to suss out, and I think the rest of it gets more difficult. My number 1 is Ohio State, and Alex Rydell asked a super chat, is Michigan equipped to exploit Ohio State's weaknesses? It seems like Ohio State can finally stop the run. Does that end the conversation? And I don't think it ends the conversation, but it goes a long way because that highlights the differences. Ohio State is playing offensively not as consistently as they did last year. They did look shaky today. You can tell losing Wilson and Olave was something they could replace. Losing them and a healthy Smith and Jigba throws off the rhythm, and they kind of get back with it sometimes. And you could tell almost they were better off without him playing with a healthy set of receivers. But I don't think it's the same explosiveness. I think it had a lot to do with how tired Iowa got. But that is balanced by the fact that Ohio State can play very high-level defense. That gives them an edge right now, having what has been a consistently good offense and defense that no one else can really match. Even if they've had quarters where they don't appear, everybody else has had games where one side of the ball or the other hasn't looked good. So they're my clear number 1. Georgia's my number 2. I think they're still the more complete team than anybody else in college football. They're certainly one of the more talented. Even the games people talk about, Kent State game or the Missouri game, those were turnover-related games. There were games where they significantly really outperformed the other team per play for most of the game. They were still, I think, from a projection standpoint, a team that looks like they could play better, but just had a really bad day those days. And they still came out and they still won, and they still carried a multi-score lead for quarters of those games. Like Kent State, second quarter, they took a 2-score lead. They never relinquished it. They just didn't quite bury Kent State the way people would hope. That's still a very, very good football team. Michigan is my number 3. They look a lot like Georgia, but just, I think, frankly, just probably not quite as good a version of it. I like the explosiveness they found, but I also don't like how they sputter. I'm not going to punish them for having a bye week. They continue to be, an undefeated Michigan team that I think is very good. But I have a lot of the same concerns I had going into the playoff last year, where it's like Georgia, to me, just seems like a more athletic version than Michigan. It's just sort of rarefied air. Tennessee's my number 4. Beating Alabama is the best win anybody has in college football. Tennessee has a lot of top 25 wins. They have a good record. They have an offense that is probably second only to Ohio State's. And in terms of consistency and rhythm, I know people don't want to hear it. They might be better than Ohio State's. I don't think they have the same talent that Ohio State does, but they're performing on a more consistent basis. And it's not just the passing game. Their run game is very good. And when you combine the passing game with receivers with wide splits, with a lot of speed, a quarterback that throws a great deep ball, and an interior run game that can really pound you up the middle to complement that with a really experienced offensive line, it's very difficult to stop. The problem in Tennessee is the defense is bad. It is bad. It's not good. The run defense is pretty good. The pass defense is bad. And that is going to kind of limit where I view them from a ceiling perspective, and probably going to end up biting them at some point this year. My next team, my number 5 team, is Alabama. And, that Tennessee loss, as Daniel was saying, that Tennessee loss was a loss on the road at Tennessee in a game where Alabama had every chance at the end of the game to win the game. It's hard to drop them a lot more than that. As we often say, if you're number 2 and you lose in a last-second field goal to another team that is number 1, it's still reasonable to keep you number 2. And Alabama is sort of the beneficiary of that. They lost to a team that we legitimately think is a top 5 team. So it's hard for me to drop them a lot further than that, especially in view of the teams behind them, which, that we really quickly are getting to the point here where you're going to say these teams don't deserve to be in the top 10. Believe me, trying to put a team in instead, because the teams get really flawed really fast. Clemson is the next team. They narrowly beat Syracuse. They were down in that game. Now, Syracuse finally had a healthy starting quarterback. They've been a pretty good team with Schrader at times. But like Daniel said, it's not a talented team. Even with an offense with Schrader being pretty good, at the skill positions, they don't have much talent. They don't have receiver talent to really expose Clemson. If they did, I think Clemson would have been in a pretty darn big hole. And what really was disturbing to me, as much as DJU was not effective, was inaccurate. Everything that he's been over the past couple of years from an inconsistency perspective showed up. It's the fact that they went to the freshman, and the freshman himself wasn't very effective. He was effective with his legs. He gave him a spark, but he wasn't particularly effective throwing the football. That offense still has problems, and the defense can be scored on, unlike the last few years. Clemson is a more vulnerable team, and I've said for a while they have the highest potential for a team outside that top group, but I don't know that they're going to hit it. And at this point, I don't think they will. I think they're a reasonably good team, and I almost worry that I have them ranked too high, to be honest. The team behind them, for me, is TCU. I think TCU has one of the top offenses in college football from a speed and talent perspective. They're very underrated. Duggan is playing at a high level. I do not like the defenses. I don't think TCU has a great defense. I've watched them for weeks now. Even in the Kansas State game, I think they've shown problems. And yeah, they played pretty well, but Martinez got banged up, didn't play the whole game. Like the Kansas game, right? Kansas is not a phenomenal football team. And that may have looked like a good win at the time, and I'm not really sure it was. But the offense is good enough right now, and high-level offenses are at such a premium that it keeps them in that slot, especially given their record. After TCU, in my opinion, it's kind of like the void or just sort of this quagmire of teams that all have major warts that you can throw in a pot. And the problem is the teams that have the best records, I don't necessarily view as being the best teams. The SEC has beat itself up quite badly. If you look through the roster, there are a lot of 2 and 3 loss teams in the SEC, and it makes it very easy to pick them apart, talk about why they're flawed, why a team like Kentucky doesn't need to be a top 10 team because of who they've lost to. But then you start getting into second level, comparisons, and it gets tough, right? Florida beat Utah. We want to talk about Utah as a top 25 team, and they were a top 15 team last week. Florida beat Utah, and Florida is on the bottom tier of the SEC really right now. So, is it really viable to have Kentucky at 19 at 5-2 and Utah at 15 at 5-2 the way the AP did last week? I don't really think so. I don't think it makes sense. I don't think you should be ranking Utah ahead of Kentucky, given what I've seen from those teams. But for these purposes in a top 10 world, I've got to give a lot of credence to the teams that only got one loss. And right now, Oklahoma State, with their win over Texas, gets my number 8 slot. I thought Texas was the team about to creep into the top 10. If they won, they would have been in my top 10. I think they're a top 10 quality team, but I think, like Daniel said, they're a flawed team. But Oklahoma State deserves credit for beating them. I think they were a good football team with a somewhat inconsistent offense and a good defense. A good defense, not a good defense, a pretty poor defense, gave up over 500 yards and gave up over 500 yards in a game where Ewers was playing really, really poorly, frankly. Texas had been clicking on all cylinders. They could have had 600 plus yards in that game. They could have easily outscored Oklahoma State, but that's enough right now to be at number 8. My number 9 is Oregon. For all my criticisms of Oregon, the fact that I don't think the Pac-12 is particularly good this year, they got one loss. And at this point, they're playing pretty good football. They're handling the teams in front of them. That's enough to be a top 10 team. And really the same thing Daniel said. I don't think they compete with Georgia or Ohio State or Alabama, but nobody does at this tier, not on a consistent basis. My number 10 is really in the same boat as USC. I do not like putting USC in the top 10. Obviously, Oregon and USC are probably going to sort themselves out, but it's hard for me not to with one loss. I mean, if you go down and you look at the other teams available, I can't really put UCLA in after this week. I don't think Wake Forest is a great team. I've seen them play Vanderbilt and a couple others. I think they're kind of lucky the fact that Clemson is really not a great team, that they stayed in that football game. Syracuse was a bit of a pretender. Penn State is one that I have to throw around because of where they're at. Beating Minnesota pretty good. And that says a lot, right? They're Mississippi State loses, Kentucky sitting there, Illinois sitting there that I don't think is a great team. It's a quagmire. And quite frankly, it's hard for me to remember a year where from the rankings from a quality perspective and the rankings from an AP perspective are so different. And it has to do with the fact that really, I think the conferences have as much differentiation as they've ever had. I think the SEC and the Big Ten are a good clip above the rest of the conferences in college football right now. They're beating themselves up, but they're beating themselves up and getting bad records with teams that would probably blow out a lot of teams in other conferences. Our BYU gets blown out by Liberty. Cincinnati is high in rankings. Arkansas beat Cincinnati. Arkansas beat and blew out BYU. And nobody's considering Arkansas for a top 25 ranking. That's kind of the problem. So that's how I ran out my top 10. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, and you probably heard me while I was doing mine, and you wanted to save me from screwing up on the TCU Kansas State thing. Guys, I don't. After looking at this, I did not see that final, and that's the problem with doing these live and not getting time to digest everything. So my apologies on that. Obviously, I would have TCU where Kansas State is, maybe even ahead, because I have Kansas State further down. So I'd probably have TCU right at that 7 spot. Like you, I really like their offense. I'm concerned with their defense, but obviously clean record. And I think that, we said the TCU Oklahoma State winner is going to be at least playing for that Big 12 championship. But TCU's put themselves in a position to, down the stretch, like they can even, in my opinion, afford a loss and still make the playoffs.